Today's tale comes from a curious article that was brought to my attention from newzealandstuff.co.nz. Published in April of 2009, the article tells of the infamous Hooker's Hut, which is said to be the oldest mountain hut upon Aoraki, Mount Cook. Over more than a century, many visitors to the hut, located high up on the Hooker Glacier, have claimed encounters with something disturbingly unnatural. Perched in its previous remote situation, the hut was a 3-hour walk from the visitor centre, sitting around 1,100 metres above Mount Cook village. The isolation of the sleepout for resting hikers lent itself to the unnerving experiences of more than a few who had dared to spend the night. In 2009, mountain guide Jane Morris, along with Monica Yeoman, an assistant from the local visitor centre, arrived at the antique cabin around dusk on Friday of March 20. They ate dinner together before settling down for the evening, climbing into their warm sleeping bags in anticipation of a well-earned night of sleep. But their hopes of a peaceful rest soon came to a rattling end when 15 minutes after lights out, in this lonely cabin up on the glacier, with no apparent company but themselves and the mountain wind, Jane suddenly heard footsteps upon the decking outside. The ominous footsteps were followed by the sound of someone unloading a backpack. In her words, the noise was constant. It seemed to have gone on long enough for their ears and imaginations to define what was happening just outside the door in the icy darkness. It certainly wasn't an animal, one of them reported, recalling how she suddenly heard the sound of an ice axe hitting the corrugated iron of the hut. The disturbance sounded organized. The article went on to describe how both women bravely went outside to face whoever had decided to join them for the night, only to discover absolutely nothing. No doubt baffled by discovering themselves to be completely alone, they returned to their beds, where after 5 minutes of silence they began to hear the sound of pots clanging. It is hardly surprising that sleep evaded the two women as the sound of clanging and shuffling continued outside for much of the night. After their initial fright, as the noises relentlessly robbed them of sleep, Monica and Jane ended up becoming more intrigued than afraid as they grew used to and accepted what was happening. And needless to say, they made it to the following day, resumed their hike, and returned later in the afternoon to retrieve some of their belongings before leaving the glacier. Upon their return, Jane Morris recalled feeling a presence of some kind. However, she didn't find it to be menacing or nefarious, and both ladies were actually eager to go back there one day to rule out any remaining doubt they may have had concerning their encounter. Of course, their tale is not an isolated one. Over 100 years ago, one of the hut's builders, Peter Graham, claimed that while tramping alone in 1913, he spent a long night of his own contending with the sound of unaccounted-for footsteps pacing inside the hut, along with the sound of a man turning over in one of the bunk beds. While researching these accounts, I also found an anonymous comment from one reader who told the story of his father who stayed in the hut in the late 1970s. During the night of his ordeal, someone started knocking on the door, even though there was absolutely no one outside. Soon afterward, he and his mountaineering friends heard a very loud clanging noise. Apparently, a secured snow shovel had somehow been dislodged from its position and thrown a considerable distance from the hut and into the snow. It is worth mentioning that the hut was closed to the public in the 1990s due to storms that washed away its access. It remained mostly unused for much of the following 2 decades before it was airlifted out in 2015, restored, and eventually relocated 2 hours' walk from Whitehorse Hill. It would be very interesting to find out if the ghostly encounters have continued since its recent relocation. But in truth, the hut has been moved 4 times in more than a century. I, for one, am curious to hear more stories like this one. Have you ever encountered anything like this? Have you heard the sound of boots on the floor despite there being no one there? Have you heard the clanging of pots and pans where there were none? Please share your tale with me by writing to tellyourtalehere@gmail.com. or simply follow the link in the description below. And until next time, be careful where you sleep.